Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I am your host, Vikas Swarup. In this episode, we will focus on the war in Ukraine as it enters its second year and how it has changed Europe and the world. On February 24th last year, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched what he described as a special military operation in Ukraine aimed at demilitarization and denazification of the country to protect ethnic Russians, prevent Kyiv's NATO membership, and to keep it in Russia's sphere of influence. The West called it an illegal act of aggression against a country with a democratically elected government and imposed stringent economic sanctions on Russia. The expectation that Russia might have had of a quick operation in Ukraine that would perhaps end with a regime change in Kyiv was belied as Ukraine, under President Volodymyr Zelensky, fought back, aided by billions of dollars worth of armaments provided by the US-led Western alliance. Both sides are currently engaged in a war of attrition, trying to wear down the other by inflicting casualties and attempting to reverse territorial gains or losses. The war has already killed thousands, forced millions to flee their homes, reduced entire cities to rubble, and has stoked fears the confrontation could slide into an open conflict between Russia and NATO, even involving the use of nuclear weapons. The UN Secretary General has warned that the prospects for peace are diminishing, the chances of further escalation and bloodshed are growing, and it could lead to a wider war. So what does a long drawn-out war mean for Russia and the West? Is there any chance for peace at all? And can India play a role? To discuss all these issues, I have with me two outstanding experts. Dr. C. Raja Mohan is Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi and one of the world's leading commentators on foreign affairs. Dr. Ummu Bava is Professor and Jean Monnet Chair at the Center for European Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University and an expert on European foreign and security policy. A very warm welcome to both of you. Let me begin with you, Dr. Raja Mohan. The war in Ukraine, which is Europe's biggest land war since the Second World War, has now lasted a full year. How do you see the current military equation?
I think we're going to see the situation get worse. The last few weeks of winter has seen a slowdown in the military operations. Both sides were recouping, remobilizing, and strengthening their relative positions. So what we see now is Russia is actually in the middle of a new offensive. At three different points along the frozen front line, they're pushing ahead. And the Ukrainians are also preparing for a counteroffensive, probably waiting for the new weapons to come from the Western countries. So I think you're going to see a renewed escalation and an intensification of the conflict by the two sides. But at the same time, the prospects for a clear winner at this point, I think, looks doubtful. So we're in for a further confrontation, and my sense is the loss of life and the tragedy of Ukraine will continue to unfold in the coming months.
Dr. Bava, now much of Europe was heavily reliant on Russia for energy. There were also substantial cultural, commercial and financial ties between Europe and Russia. So how has this war transformed Europe's relationship with Russia?
So Europe's relation with Russia has gone through a multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral, and if I could use the word, a paradigm shift. The fact that they were slow to respond in 2014 when Crimea was annexed, and that a full-blown war has now started in its 1 year, has increased the cost of engagement which had continued. And so decoupling from Russia has imposed all kinds of political, economic and security cost. Russia in the meantime has increased the cost of this decoupling. So as some of the days of cheap and always available gas and oil through Russia, through the Nord Stream pipeline 1 and the uncommissioned Nord Stream pipeline 2, and all that has come to an end. So Europe is now seeking to diversify, which in some ways may be good. It will go towards more green and more hydrogen. Politically, it has, meant that all kinds of cooperation with Russia has come to a standstill. And third, it has also put important questions on security and what kind of security architecture will evolve in the future, in which the question about Russia is now, like a loose cannon. Will Russia at some point be part of it, without it, against it? All of that is up for discussion. So a very difficult terrain, and in one which deep thinking and in which Europe has to take a far more collective action.
Dr. Raja Mohan, what does this war mean for President Biden and the transatlantic alliance? Has Europe accepted America's leadership of the alliance now?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, everyone was assuming that NATO had little future. Macron, the French president, had once, 2 years ago, called NATO brain dead. But what we've seen is really the return of NATO, and I would even say a measure of unity within the West. So I would say two reasons. I mean, I think one, quite clearly, Europe can't defend itself. Although Europe is 10 times richer than Russia, its capacity to defend itself, it's never created these structures for self-defense. You have the NATO, which is the transatlantic alliance. Europe itself, they occasionally talk about strategic autonomy, European security institutions, but the fact is, when it comes to the crunch, they need the Americans. And I think that has been proven in good abundance. And my sense is the West is back. The West has got, in fact, it's very interesting. I would say not only Germany, but also Japan. The third largest economy, Japan, the fourth largest economy, Germany, both have now been fully mobilized. Because until recently, they were kind of neutralist, pacifist, not wanting to do military things. But I think both of them have been fully mobilized against Russia as well as China. So I think it's a big moment in the history of the evolution of the Western coalitions.
Dr. Bava, what has been the impact of the war on the global economy?
So on the global economy, this has created a multiple, domino effect. We were coming out of COVID, in which already economic slowdown had been witnessed. You had already seen the demand for energy go down tremendously. And now the war has created an impact which, though localized in terms of the loss of life and population, its ramifications are global in this interconnected world. So we've seen across the sectors, rising energy costs, rising commodity prices, hedging and betting on commodity prices happening. And of course, putting a sense of uncertainty in terms of, can you predict better growth rates? So for everybody, growth, if there's an absence of growth, it's also going to create social problems and social tensions. We will see, unrise, happening, protests happening as people tackle their food bills and grocery bills and are not able to manage with day-to-day, inflation. On the other hand, it has also brought into focus with COVID is this dependence on single supply chains and the fact that supply chains from Ukraine and Russia, since Russia is the world's largest fertilizer producer, Ukraine in terms of food grains, both of them got severely impacted. So you're looking at a moment of opportunity, possibly of rethink, but also a long road ahead in terms of global economic recovery. I think that's going to be on the table for a long time.
Dr. Raja Mohan, the West had hoped that its sanctions plus a prolonged war would bleed the Russian economy to a point of collapse. It was predicted that Russia's GDP would contract by 12%. But according to the IMF, the Russian economy will actually grow by 0.3% this year and by 2.1% in 2024. So how has the Russian economy managed to remain so resilient?
Because I think it's because of the rich natural resources that Russia has. See, 2 points. I mean, I think one, sanctions never brought down anyone, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Iran, or Pakistan for that matter. I mean, I think in the case of Russia, Russia has a large territory, large amount of natural resources, while Europe has cut down oil imports to some extent. China and India have enhanced the imports. While the volumes have gone down, the price has gone up. Because of the sanctions, the oil price has gone up. And within that, even with discounts that India and China are getting, Russia has managed to generate revenues. And I think recently, it's also been reported that all of Russia's neighbors are suddenly importing a lot of things from the West and exporting it to Russia. So I think sanctions, are effective over the longer term. But in the near term, there are always ways of avoiding it and there are enough number of people with incentive to circumvent them.
Dr. Bava, now picking up the point about NATO, as Professor Raja Mohan pointed out, just 3 years ago, President Emmanuel Macron of France had declared it brain dead. Do you think this war has now definitely revived it?
NATO is definitely back on the block. It is the best actor which can, produce security, guarantee security, and defend security. I think the transition, if you look at the 2010 strategic concept, which was put out at that point, still spoke about cooperation between, America, the EU, Europe, and Russia. And if you look at the last strategic concept, which was unveiled last year in 2022, with the backdrop of the Ukraine war, you can clearly see that the first time in very specific terms it says that Russia is a new threat. So there is no mincing of words. One has to recognize the European Union does not have the wherewithal to be in any way a military actor. It cannot produce that kind of result, though there is some kind of an understanding within the Lisbon Treaty as well to defend the states. So what makes NATO the attractive actor is Article 5. And the fact that with the return of a conventional war, with a return on the issues of sovereignty, on holding territory, who can be better than NATO, which can mobilize in terms of the kind of assets it has and the kind of power that it can display. And more importantly, it's about the political community and the fact that it's reiterated that it is here for collective defense. And I think probably, the cherry for the picking is that two neutral countries, Finland and Sweden,
yes,
have decided to join. I think that more than anything else is an endorsement that NATO is back and is the key security actor in Europe.
Yes, I think one of the unintended consequences of Putin's war against Ukraine has been actually to dampen the contradictions within the West. In fact, Russia had very good relationship with a large number of countries, economically with Germany in particular, deep economic relationship. A lot of the right-wing parties in Europe were quite besotted with Putin. So in a way, actually, by making this bold and somewhat, I would say, miscalculation, that he's actually compelled much of Western Europe to come together, because all the smaller countries on Russia's periphery are afraid. If they can do it to Ukraine, tomorrow they could be their turn. Therefore, they need protection. And there's only one game in town, which is NATO in Europe.
Dr. Raja Mohan, the partnership between Russia and China is now arguably stronger than it has ever been. How has that been impacted by the war in Ukraine?
No, in fact, it preceded the war in Ukraine. If you remember, February 4th, when the Beijing Winter Olympics opened, President Putin traveled to Beijing, and the two leaders, issued a fairly ostentatious, long declaration denouncing the West, Western values, Western ideas, and that Russia and China will work together to save the world. So in some senses, whether Putin had told Xi Jinping the full details of what he was planning to do, because 3 weeks later, Russian army was marching across into Ukraine. So in a way, the deepening connect between Russia and China, which was building up over the last 10 years, was expressed itself just before the war. And since the war, we've seen China, carefully avoided endorsing Russian position, but they've also not criticized Russia. In fact, they now blame the US and the West for provoking this war. And in the last 2 days, if you noticed, the Chinese leader Wang Yi was in Europe, really attacking the West for creating this problem. Then he traveled to Moscow. So my sense is Russia and China were getting together just before the war. They announced an alliance without limits. And today, I think all indications are they're going to get even closer. I think which will have huge repercussions, both for Europe and for Asia, because you have two land powers are coming together. And I think this will impact the geopolitics of the region very, very profoundly.
Dr. Bava, you want to comment on this?
If I add to that, I would say that this alliance, the fact that both of them are autocracies, this alliance also means that as Russia goes through the war, it will spend itself out at some point. So it will be interesting to see the kind of power equation which will now emerge between Moscow and Beijing. Will then Russia be the kind of the junior partner? At this point, maybe from a point where both of them are together, but going down the road, would it emerge as a junior partner? And what does then that mean for China and China's own game plan in town, which is very much different from what it's doing? It's, of course, taking, I think, big lessons in terms of what will happen in the South China Sea. We may not see similar kind of a attack and hold, but it may be a very different kind of a strategy. But definitely it means that you've also got 2 UN Security Council members, in tandem together with the rest on the other side. So it's a very clear lines of confrontation, I think, have been drawn out.
I think the relative balance between them has fundamentally changed. I mean, I think going back to 1950, just after the People's Republic of China was formed, the Chinese leader was saying we must learn from the Soviet Union. They will teach us the methodology for economic growth and development, how to build a socialist society. Today, I think the Chinese GDP is 10 times larger than Russia's. And in a while Russia is still a major weapons producer, a whole lot of other new technologies, China is far ahead. So I think the balance in some ways is already shifted. And I think the key difference is China always reaches out to the West and say, let's do business. Because China and the US alone have $800 billion worth of trade, while Russia has burnt its boats with the West. So in a sense, China has become stronger, irrespective of what the Putin's original intentions have been, both vis-a-vis Russia as well as vis-a-vis the West.
So what lessons do you think China would have learned from the Russia-Ukraine war?
No, my sense is they're a bit upset. In fact, Wang Yi in Munich was saying, please don't say Ukraine equals to Taiwan. Because I think that is the message that quite clearly has resonated. If Russia, armed with nuclear weapons, can take over another country, China, if Russia had prevailed in this war, one view is that, look, China would feel emboldened by seizing and would be emboldened to seize Taiwan. Because I think for them, the idea that a Western defeat in Ukraine would mean deeper divisions within the West. You remember both Putin and Xi thought American withdrawal from Afghanistan showed the Western weaknesses, and that a defeat in Ukraine would have made it worse. So in some senses, that both of them could have put simultaneous pressure on the US in Europe and in Asia. But what we now have is US is actually putting simultaneous pressure on both of them.
Let's now turn to the impact on India. Now, New Delhi has maintained its strategic autonomy on this issue, not joining the Western chorus to condemn Russia, reminding Russia of the importance of the UN Charter, and telling President Putin that this is not the era of war, and also managing to buy Russian oil at discounted prices. Dr. Raja Mohan, how do you see India's role, and what are the stakes for India in this war?
Look, I think there are 2-3 issues. I mean, I think while India has navigated the contradictions that posed by this war in protecting its own interests, but I think the longer the war lasts, I think this balancing act will get harder and harder. Because right now, the West has been willing to, cut some slack for India, saying that, look, we understand why India's historic relationship with Russia is. But if Russia raises the level of confrontation with the West, I think the room for us to navigate will shrink. Oil purchases, I think, was really an opportunistic sale, and I don't see, if it is available, India would buy it. And I think there, again, the West has largely conceded the point, India buying the oil does not fundamentally affect their interests. But my sense is there is a third issue which we don't debate enough, that if you can, for India and most of the developing world, sovereignty, territorial integrity are fundamental principles. And I think the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, would that mean China can do something similar in Asia? Because after all, we have a problem in Ladakh, we have a problem in Arunachal. So if major powers can get away with unilateral use of force, I think that outcome is not good for us. And I think this is something we'll have to think more clearly about in the coming days, because we face that problem from China on a daily basis for the last many years. And if China thinks that it can actually seize other people's territories and claim that, look, this is my historical right, I think that precedent, is a big problem for India.
Dr. Bava, in the year of its G20 presidency, can India make peace in Europe?
So that's a billion-dollar question with everything riding on stake. I think the fact that you've seen a Biden visit to Ukraine, you've seen this, effort to really shore up Ukraine, means that we're looking at a long and prolonged war. I don't think any war fatigue or engagement fatigue has set in at this point. Everybody is looking at Ukraine as symbolic of fighting for the values of a liberal order and the West. And so the question is then, where does India fit onto this large, action on the table, and is there a space for it? I think there is a space for it because as the 5th largest economy, I think that itself brings a lot of weight. Everybody wants a piece of that action, wants to engage with India. The point is, are both sides even willing to look for an exit from the war? I think that's where then the role of good offices and the role of negotiations and offering to play an honest broker on both sides, which India at this point has a few cards in hand. And as Raja pointed out, the longer the war continues, the longer entrenched the positions become, these windows of opportunities may or may not present themselves. So a G20 is a good, it's a good platform where a diversity of, countries are represented and where India can play the role of the honest broker to say, listen, ultimately you have to have a diplomatic solution to this. War cannot be indefinitive. And one has to see that, are you going to, what kind of pressures will come to play to create a tipping point where it becomes untenable for either side to continue in the war. At this point, it's not looking, but I think India should continue backroom, diplomacy in the sense of keeping the channels open. We are one of the few countries which still carries some kind of good offices. And Zelensky himself has said, he would hope that India would come forward. Of course, it's with a lot of caveats in what he wants, every inch of territory be returned. So I think India at this point has a certain diplomatic advantage. We have to see that how do we keep it best by engaging continuously. We can't do a piecemeal engagement, but this has to be sustained. The humanitarian dimension can be brought in. So multiple opportunities can come up. And the fact that the G20 is looking at about the health of the global economy, the war is going to have ramifications. So one can look at, finding certain exemptions or some ways to at least, insulate or protect the global economy, of which even they too will also be the beneficiaries.
You want to comment? I would say, look, the history of warfare tells us peace breaks out when one side is defeated or both sides are completely exhausted. So we are not at that point today. So I think the problem of any peacemaking, the Chinese are trying their hand. I mean, India would also be interested. But the difference in the positions between those of Ukraine and the West and those of Russia are fundamentally, irreconcilable. Yes. Ukraine wants its sovereignty back. Russia says Ukraine should have limited sovereignty, that it should not have the choice to get into NATO. So I think we are really at a difficult moment. But this situation, I think, would evolve. And for India, there are two aspects. One is a technical peacemaking, mediation, facilitation, and that kind. Other is that for its own interests, India should see what are the likely consequences. And if this leads to a fundamental change in the major power relations, and I think India should be engaged with this conflict, finding ways in which the long-term outcomes from this do not hurt India's interests.
So let's finally try to divine the future of this war. Now, NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has said that NATO must be prepared for the conflict with Russia to last many, many years, beyond the immediate invasion of Ukraine. Do you share this assessment? Or is a peace deal still possible?
No, as I said, I mean, unless one of them falls apart, I mean, at this point, it looks impossible. And I would think that a prolonged war seems to be the most likely outcome. And this would have great effect on European geopolitics. It will have an effect on relations between US, China, Europe, and Russia. And for us too. And I think we have to be, if we're going to be prepared for that, I think we need to go back to the first principles of where this war is going, what does it mean for us, and how do we protect our interests.
Dr. Bava, now is the world indeed headed towards a wider war with its eyes wide open, as the UN Secretary General has warned?
Well, the UN Secretary General's words are, I won't say prophetic or ominous. It's a kind of an early warning that everybody needs to, come onto the table to decide what is it you want, because the consequences of war are clearly evident on the global level, at the regional level, for every individual country. So if it's all about taking sides in the war, I think at the end we're going down a narrow, slippery slope where nobody's going to be the winner. The point is, there has been, since the outbreak of the war, an attempt to create a very binary narrative. You're either with one or the other group. So where does that leave those countries who don't want to be part of that, right? That kind of a binary construct of the current geopolitics at play. it's not going to serve India's interest as well, right? I mean, the fact that there is territorial aggression, there is a violation of international law, but it's not the first time that war has taken place, and it's not going to be the last time as well. The point is, will this become a precedence? And I think it also draws attention to the fact that do UN Security Council members, the permanent members, can they get away with the violation of international law? What does it tell us about the shifting power equations and other countries, right? I mean, India has always put to a litmus test. What will you do? You want to be a UN Security Council member. We have not done any of these kind of things. But then, are we also in a position, or is multilateralism, the way it is structured today, has that broken down? Is the UN incapable of doing when one of its own permanent members, is involved in a war? So I think it's a moment to do a stock taking and to ask that how do we do, can we have even, it's probably a misnomer to say clean politics, but can interest and values be accommodated in which a collective good, which is what multilateral should produce, can that be sustained? I think that is the critical question.
But Russia has alleged that NATO is actually conducting a proxy war in Ukraine against it. Do you think there is truth in what Russia is saying?
Look, I think the word proxy war, kind of glosses over the fact that one country was attacked by another country.
But Russia's security interests...
No, that's fair. I think the central question is, look, do Russia's Western neighbors, the smaller countries, from the Baltics to the Balkans, do they have agency? Do they have a choice of their security preferences? I think that's the question. I think, unfortunately, we don't debate that question. If you're sitting next to a giant, the question is, do they have interests? How do they protect their security? One is to accommodate and praise the Lord, the large country. Other is to balance the country. And I think ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, the East European countries went straight into NATO. The others fear Russia's power, Russia's past. Therefore, they're looking for security guarantees. And I think, in a way, the attack has forced the issue. For example, Sweden and Finland, really neutral, right? Historically neutral countries have joined NATO. So I think the question is, do smaller countries have choices? And I think that's where the problem is, because what is the answer to this is, as Ummu said earlier, how do you integrate Russia into a comprehensive European security structure? So I think Russia cannot simply claim other people's lands, while at the same time, addressing Russia's security concerns means that an overarching piece, not just who gets what territory, that Russia is treated as an equal partner, because given its size, its great power history, that it should be accommodated into the European security institutions. And I think that is the challenge. And hopefully this war, at some point, will lead to a fresh look. How do you accommodate Russian interests without violating the sovereignty of the smaller countries?
Well, thank you very much for these illuminating insights into the past, the present, and the future of the war in Ukraine. This war has shaken the foundation of international geopolitics. It has set in motion tectonic shifts in political and economic relations, disrupted energy markets, and upended existing supply chains. Only time will tell whether the war will throw up a victor, end up as a frozen conflict, or enter an even more dangerous phase. Thank you for watching Diplomatic Dispatch. This was our 70th episode. Thank you for all your support. Until we meet again next week, take care and goodbye.